Okay. Well, welcome everyone. And this is our final webinar for the fall 2021 portion of our season. So we'll be pausing until January for those of you who are interested in joining those next series of webinars beginning in 2022. I'm Lauren Kilroy-Eubank. I'm the Dean of Content and Strategy at Smarthistory, and I'm really excited for today's webinar. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Becker, who is a Mediterranean archaeologist at Binghamton University, and he teaches broadly on Mediterranean archaeology and Greco-Roman art history, and he is our content editor extraordinaire for all things of the ancient Mediterranean. He'll be talking with us today about Trajan's Forum and Column, just a very small, easy thing to do, and offering us some teaching strategies and helping us to maybe, again, rethink, how we might approach it in our survey classes. So thank you, Jeffrey. And before I turn over to him, just a reminder that if you have questions, it's very useful for me at the end, if you could please post them in the Q&A instead of in the chat, just to keep things easy. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn the screen over to Jeffrey.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for your welcome. Glad to be here with you all to talk about things Trajanic. Steven Zucker has helpfully plopped into the chat box the link for a handout to accompany these comments. You'll find there, in some cases, verbatim some of the things you will see on the screen, as well as links to other resources, Smarthistory resources and other resources that can help you in your thinking and teaching with respect to the Forum and the Column of Trajan in Rome. The brief is not brief in that things Trajanic are both physically and conceptually enormous. And I think that one thing about approaching canonical objects like these two is that they can seem a bit daunting. The sort of comprehensivity that one might think one has to command in order to have a conversation about the Forum of Trajan can be off-putting. And I think that this is one reason that, and here I'm going to plug Lauren's Reframing Art History project, in which I'm very happily a participant. One thing that can sort of break that impasse of needing a sort of a comprehensivity on board to have a discussion about the monument is context. And so one of the things I want to stress here today is that we need to think about objects that are part of the canon, whether we're approaching this in advanced placement art history course and trying to cover things that are on the AP list, or whether we're trying to approach this in the context of an introductory undergraduate classroom where often the mandate is to cover some slice of Greco-Roman material culture in one semester. We need to think about activating these objects a bit, and we need to enliven the canon by remembering that we can, in many cases, reanimate objects by putting them into appropriate social, cultural, economic context that surrounded their creation. And we also, especially in the case of things like the Forum and Column of Trajan, we also have to be cognizant of the afterlives of these objects and the parts and roles that they have played in shaping, for instance, our views of the past, parts and roles that they have played in creating our own material culture and influencing our own strategies with respect to, for example, monumentality and strategies of commemoration. The Forum and Column of Trajan are two components of a large, sprawling complex of sacro-civic squares that we conventionally refer to as imperial fora. These complexes, which really begin with the choice of the 1st century BCE statesman Julius Caesar to build a forum celebrating the divine lineage of his own family group, separate from but adjacent to the much earlier sort of archaic center of the city, the Forum Romanum, eventually culminates with the Forum of Trajan, the final one of these complexes to be added to this monumental area of sacro-civic spaces. The Forum of Trajan is not only the latest in date, but it is also the largest in terms of the amount of area it covers, and indeed is one of the most opulent monumental squares in the ancient city. We are not, far from, we're not the first people to be impressed by the scale, the monumentality, the opulence of the Forum of Trajan. And indeed, this passage from the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, which is repeated on your handout, is an interesting testament to the idea that there has always been a fascination with and an awareness of the impressive scope of Trajan's project. Ammianus relates that Constantius II, a Roman emperor centered mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean, makes one visit to Rome in the mid-4th century, and he'd never been there before. And a motivating factor for Constantius to come to Rome is to look upon the works of Trajan. And this quotation, which I confess to be rather taken with, and you'll see it in a couple of iterations in resources that I've produced for Smart History, Constantius is said to be sort of awed by what he sees when he came to the Forum of Trajan, a construction unique under the heavens, as we believe, and admirable even in the unanimous opinion of the gods. He stood fast in amazement, turning his attention to the gigantic complex about him, beggaring description, and never again to be imitated by mortal man. Constantius would make a fairly friendly architecture critic in that he looks upon these works and sees them as essentially divinely inspired and impossible to eclipse. This sort of entry of the Forum and Column of Trajan into this kind of seemingly eternal monumental bracket is an interesting point to consider in thinking about not just the initial life, but also the afterlife of these complexes. To some extent, elements of the Forum and Column of Trajan have always been to one degree or another visible since their creation in the 2nd century. More on that in a second. But the post-ancient use, reuse, and accumulation of settlement in and around the ancient center of the city of Rome transforms this area dramatically. Much of what you see in the reconstructed plan here, much of what you see if you go and visit Rome in person today, is largely revealed through massive archaeological works undertaken primarily in the 1930s by Rome's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, interested in his own way in connecting himself and his regime to the sort of Rome's ancient past and the physical reminders of that past. So the landscape, the archaeological landscape as visible today is a little bit unusual. It's a little bit artificial in that there was a manifest interest in the 20th century in clearing away the accumulation of post-ancient, medieval, and Renaissance architecture and accumulation in this area to reveal this space. And that, in a sense, is kind of the same phenomenon of fascination that Constantius II is expressing, wanting a connection to these spaces for the ideas that they carry with them. So what's going on? What are the ideas that come with these complexes, and what can we do with them, so to speak, in our own time? I think that when I think about the Forum of Trajan, the Column of Trajan, and especially when I talk about those monuments with my students, there are a number of themes that sort of lend themselves readily to Trajanic monumental architecture. Oftentimes, in various ways in my own teaching, I'm interested in dissecting with students what exactly monumentality means and how monumentalization works and why, as a species, we tend to do it and why we tend to be attracted towards monumental forms. Monumentum in Latin is a reminder, a calling to mind. And in essence, that noun comes from a verb meaning to warn about something, to call to mind, to advise. And so there's always this sort of, ominous, portentous layer to something that is monumental. We're supposed to notice it. We're supposed to notice it in such a way that it reminds us about certain individuals, certain values, and that these processes of commemoration, the calling to mind, are very important in sort of the dynamics that drive Romans in the imperial period to make and create monumental forms. They're very interested in using art and architecture in the public space to foster a sense of collective memory, that they can look upon a physical thing, monument, monumental building, public art installation, and they can be collectively reminded of something in which they have a part, either direct or indirect. And the sort of message board quality of things like the Column of Trajan, for instance, can help Romans to foster not just collective feelings, but to reinforce collective values, collective ideas about authority, collective messages and understandings of how power works. But remember that all memory, even collective memory, is selective. One is only trying to signal certain things in monumental commissions, and in some cases explicitly omit others. So when we think about the Forum of Trajan, and especially the sculptural frieze that adorns the column, we often talk about that relief in terms of historical narrative, that in pictorial form, in sculptural form, the column tells a story, that it tells a story about events. Just like memory, history is also selective. This is a story told by Romans about Romans. And that story about what Romans are doing wants to privilege the events, the accomplishments, the persons that Romans want to remember. And in constructing this historical narrative, we often tend to think today that when we talk about historical narrative, at least in the 21st century, that it's supposed to be objective, right? It's supposed to be free from bias. Whether that's possible or not is a conversation for another much longer webinar. But in the case of thinking about historical narrative in the Roman world, we always have to remember who the narrator is. And we always have to be cognizant of the fact that the narrator is often the state, and that the state wants to tell you, the viewer, certain things about what's good about the state and what's good about the state's leadership, and why you as the viewer should in turn feel good about that. So the person who is the object of all this, to do in our case is this man, Marcus Ulpius Trajanus. We call him Trajan, conventionally speaking. He is in power from, sorry, I have an AD instead of a CE on this slide. I just realized that. He is in power from 98 until his death in 117. And having been selected on purpose to be emperor, likely because of his enormous popularity with the Roman military, he has a sort of a privileged station. He ends up with an honorific title, Optimus Princeps, that no one else who holds this job ever gets. This job signals him as not just first citizen, Princeps, but also the best, Optimus, the best first citizen. In this way, Trajan's title reminds people of the Emperor Augustus, late first century BCE to early first century CE, as he had called himself Princeps, first citizen, co-opting an ancient title from the Roman Republic. And so Trajan is sort of, pitched in titulature as man of the people, right? A leading citizen in that regard. The accomplishments that are celebrated in the Forum and Column of Trajan are, though, in fact, largely not civic accomplishments, but military accomplishments. a series of wars that we call the Dacian Wars that are fought in sort of two segments between 101 and 102, and then again 105 to 106, essentially sees the military annexation of a new province called Dacia, thus Dacian Wars, that's more or less coextant with what's now the modern country of Romania. Trajan adds this province to the Roman Empire. This is a place that is rich in natural resources, especially things like gold. And the accomplishment of annexing Dacia is an enormous one. And so the impetus for creating the Forum complex and the art and architecture that adorns it is to celebrate the military accomplishment, to celebrate Trajan himself, but also to sort of shine the spotlight on the soldiers and the army groups that participated in the Dacian Wars. And so, in a sense, this is kind of a reference back to very old Roman habits of celebrating the military successes of a state leader. The Column and Forum complex are dedicated in 113, which is the year when Trajan is off again for more conquests. This time he hopes in the east, trying to push the Roman frontier further eastward. In this, he ultimately is not successful. But the dedication of the Forum complex as Trajan steps off for his eastern campaigns is a major event. And the investment here speaks to the riches, the spoils that Trajan was able to claim and bring back as victor of the Dacian Wars. The main architectural feature in the Forum Square is a civic building, the Basilica Ulpia, Ulpia being the family group, the family network to which Trajan belongs. And it is in particular the Basilica Ulpia that attracts the attention of viewers in the long term. It's one of the buildings in which Constantius II was interested. We're left with only fragments of the Basilica Ulpia today. There are various reconstructive ideas about how it should be restored. James Becker, formerly of Northwestern University, is one of the sort of leading experts in the later 20th century in sort of the architectural visualization of the reconstruction of Basilica Ulpia and the Forum Square. Debates and scholarly sort of arguments set aside, it's safe to say confidently that this is an incredibly opulent complex. This is a no expenses spared kind of affair, and that this is in fact part of the point, right? That this is meant to be a superlative honor for someone who is viewed as a superlative individual. As important as the Basilica Ulpia is, it's the column that really often gets the lion's share of attention. Since, at least for the last, 250 years, art historians and art critics have been arguing about whether Roman art is or isn't creative. The approach to creating the Column of Trajan is inarguably novel in that while it makes reference to previous Roman habits in terms of how art forms, both painted and sculpted, are used in the public space to record events and promote ideology, the form that the Column of Trajan takes is new, in that we have the verticality of the column made of Luna marble, rising originally to just over 38 meters in height. But then this vertical column carries a helical storiated frieze, carved in relief, and telling this sort of synoptic narrative, the story of the Dacian Wars that Trajan carried out, essentially from beginning to conclusion. There are over 2,500 figures in this frieze. If you could take it off and stretch it out, It's about 190 meters long. So as a composition, it's sort of mind-blowing. And it's often studied and discussed for, what it can tell us about Roman narrative in sculpture. How do the Romans tell stories? What are the sort of pictorial and perspectival choices made by Roman sculptors? And so one sort of approach to the column has always been a source of information for those interested in reconstructing things to do with the Roman army in practice and in detail, and trying to understand things like military equipment, military tactics, architecture. We see the army building a lot of things on the column. You can see here the work of Elizabeth Wolfram-Thill, who's done a great job of sort of expounding upon what we can glean from architecture and process on the Column of Trajan. Another sort of approach is to notice Trajan, and that may be the main point, right? That this is about Trajan. Trajan appears about 6 times. You can always, even as a not very experienced viewer, you can always pick him out. This is not an accident. Clarity of narration is important, right? You want to be able to find the emperor and see what he's up to, whether he's supervising the activities as he's doing here, or whether he's involved in some sacred or civic ritual. Here he addresses the gathered soldiers from a speaker's platform with sacred symbols of the army. It's easy to pick him out. It's easy to recognize him. But we're also sort of forced to remember that the Column of Trajan is a victory monument. There are difficulties to looking at and talking about the Column of Trajan. This is a monument to Roman success. In this case, Roman success meant Dacian defeat. And so the column as a monument to victory is in some ways gruesome, right? Here, the decapitated heads of Dacian prisoners are presented to Trajan. And so we, again, have to be cognizant of what story is being told in this sense by the sculptural relief in order to think about how we should interface with it, how we should talk about it. Should we simply cheerlead the success of the Romans and be fascinated by the pictorial detail? Those things, the pictorial detail, probably that's definitely a good thing that we can do in talking about the Column of Trajan. But we should also push it further and put it into its appropriate context. Think about what commemorative strategies are in the Roman world. The suicide of the Dacian leader Decebalus essentially is the concluding event of the war. It's one of the concluding pictorial events of the entire frieze. I think we can't talk about one part and leave the other part out. We should think about Roman art as an artifact of imperialism. We should use it as an opportunity to talk about what imperialism means and how imperialism isn't always, conducted in a bloodless way, that there are costs to imperial expansion, and that the Column of Trajan and the military exploits celebrated in the accompanying forum complex are an opportunity to talk about those issues and to talk about what commemorative strategies are, how they work. I think that last point is especially important because of the influence that the Column of Trajan and the Forum of Trajan have had beyond their own time, in that the commemorative impulse, if you will, is one that exists in our world. There are many conversations right now in the United States and in other places about who's commemorated in public spaces, why are they commemorated, what are the dynamics that influence the creation, curation, appreciation, or sort of, counter reaction to those monuments. This is one useful thing we can be doing with our students in terms of talking through monumental art and architecture forums in the Roman world, because in many cases, whether we're talking about the Place Vendôme in Paris or Trafalgar Square in London or the National Mall in Washington, D.C., we certainly can make connections between these impulses that still sort of move us to commemorate. And we can think about the dynamics of what informs commemoration. We can think about the dynamics of what informs monumentality. Why are we drawn to it still? And that these are ways, I think, especially for students, to make something that's very foreign and far away, Imperial Rome is very far away in many ways, more relatable. What's commemorated in your community? How is it commemorated? Who is commemorated? What guides that strategy? And these are, urban features, the surviving ancient ones, and then post-ancient ones that in some cases derive direct influence from antiquity that are with us. We're at pains to understand why they're with us and how we should react to them, how we should interpret them. And I think that sort of the framework of thinking through imperial architecture in the Roman world is a useful parable for trying to think about monumentality and commemorative strategies, and especially to think about storytelling, narratology in art, an opportunity to sort of interrogate the story, interrogate the narrator, interrogate the purpose. Why is the story made in the first place? And so even though the Dacian Wars to us are a very far away event, the strategies that inform the creation of the monumental square and the enigmatic and inarguably aesthetically fascinating column, they're a useful and sort of, a device ready to be activated in conversations that we're having with art right now in our own time. Thanks very much for your attention and for coming. More than happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. This was great. I love how you frame this, and I really enjoyed and appreciated how you ended the discussion of the column in particular. Sorry, I'm trying to add myself here as a spotlight. We have a couple of questions, but I couldn't help, being as someone who lives in Oregon, to ask very quickly, have you ever heard of the Astoria column?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I have never had the chance to see it, but yes, it is definitely in this lineage.
Yeah. Oh, yes. For anyone who's interested, the Astoria column is basically all about kind of American claims to indigenous lands and kind of manifest destiny, and it's just kind of north of here in Astoria, Oregon, and you can Google it and find it. But it's very much modeled after Trajan's column. So just in keeping with what you ended with, I couldn't help but point that out. So it looks like we have a whole bunch of questions, and I very much encourage people to continue writing them in. We have some just immediate reactions of fabulous. Thank you so much. But their first question is, what types of business specifically were being carried out in the basilicas? Were magistrates trying court cases? Maybe you could expand a bit.
Sure, that's a great question. One of the sort of overarching phenomena that links the series of imperial forum squares together is creating more literal available space for civic function. So when Augustus dedicates his forum, the Forum of Augustus, very creative name, in 2 BCE, we start to see the sort of the transferal of certain juridical functions, both in terms of the activities of magistrates, the activities of law courts, from spaces in the old Forum Romanum, sort of across the way, towards the new imperial forum complexes. And so yes, the civic basilica in general is a flexible form of architecture, right? It can serve a multitude of functions, even at the same time. It can have civic and juridical functions. It can have mercantile functions. It can host, the sitting of various law courts, and Rome's law courts sort of, have and take different forms and require different size spaces depending on the size of the court. So yes, they can certainly be the location to host these kinds of courts and the activities of civic magistrates.
And I think we have another question that in some ways piggybacks on that one and that is that because the frieze is really sandwiched between the libraries there, do we have any sense of whether or not the frieze would be seen in its time as a scroll, and whether, and whether you have any thoughts as to the impossibility of seeing the narrative as a whole and, as being more episodic, perhaps?
That's a great question. This is, of course, one of the, fiercest points of debate about understanding the column and its original spatial context. Who is the intended viewership? Is it a mortal viewership, or is it aimed at some, ethereal viewer? It's a hard question. As recently as 2017, Amanda Claridge has sort of made a new argument where she prefers to see the column as really a device for looking at the basilica. And she has proposed a new reconstruction for the profile of the Basilica Ulpia's roof, and says provocatively the main point is to climb up to the top of the column, which you can still do if you can grease the right palms to climb the top of the Column of Trajan. And she sees it as a viewing tower, a belvedere, to look at the basilica. When you're on top of the column, and I'm lucky enough to have been there once, you can't really see the frieze. So who can see the frieze? If you stand on the ground or on the contemporary sort of quasi-modern street level outside of the archaeological area of the Forum of Trajan, you can see detail at the sort of the first third of the column very clearly. As obviously the column gets, rises higher, further away from you, your ability to perceive detail is less. There's this suggestion, and we can go back to the slide, that the flanking buildings that we sort of reconstruct as libraries, not everyone is in complete agreement about this reconstruction, right? That these two little buildings perhaps provided some sort of balcony, terrace midpoint to view the columns. It's very hard to know who's intended to see or how they're intended to see. We should remember that the frieze is, although it is no longer, it is originally stained with pigment, right? So that this would have aided to some degree the viewer by using contrasting colors to make certain scenes, certain figures sort of stand out against the background. But viewership is an important question, right? Because a lot of sort of the immediate Roman comparenda for the ideas that inform the Column of Trajan, those are things that are commissioned and executed much closer to ground level, where viewership really isn't a debate, right? The viewer can almost confront the things at eye level in some cases. So this kind of deployment is different. What inspires the story frieze? One theory is that going back to the Republican period, when the Romans used to sort of celebrate these military rituals, these victory parades, they called a triumph. One of the things that they would do to enliven the triumphal parade would be to create painted scenes and even three-dimensional dioramas that would go along on carts as part of the triumphal parade to inform the parade spectators what the war and its campaigns had been like. And so one possible explanation for where do you get the sense of this historiated frieze that narrates the war is that it draws upon that background of visual depictions created in ephemeral materials, but here translated into stone. But it doesn't answer the question of the viewership problem. It's a very thorny one. Who's meant to see, right? Seeing the suicide of Decebalus that I showed you, which is in the top rank, top register, very hard to do, right? Even if you're stood on the ground with, a good pair of binoculars or a good, telephoto lens on your camera, it's hard to see. It's difficult. So this is one of the enduring debates connected with the column.
And it's such an important one, and one that I imagine, at least in your classes and certainly in some of my own, that students get really intrigued by, right? Trying to pose, answers to a really tricky question that, there's all sorts of theories about. Although we do, when we have one follow-up question that I think is, I am also intrigued about is, how do you get to the top of the column? Is there an elevator now? Is it stairs?
Oh, no, there's a little claustrophobic stairwell, which is the original stairwell. The blocks of Luna marble are hollow in the center, right? So these blocks are probably roughed out at the quarry. They're then probably hoisted into place. You can see the excellent work of Lynn Lancaster on the dynamics of constructing the Column of Trajan. And then, a lot of the carving of the finishing is done. And this includes the creation of the little, very cramped, spiraliform internal stairway. One thing I didn't mention is that it's very likely that the base of the column was in antiquity the tomb for Trajan and his wife. So this is sort of a weird, even from a Roman point of view, a weird monument of historical commemoration, cum funeral monument. But yes, there's a little door and in the base, right? And you ascend the staircase. If anyone has fear of tight spaces or of heights, it is not a good, not recommended.
Well, we have, I think, just a couple of observations that I just thought I would share in case there's something you want to respond to, and that's that the images you were showing, say for instance, of the severed heads, that students might find that very interesting, especially as it relates to contemporary violent events that we might encounter, and that this maybe is one way of kind of grappling, like you were saying, using these ancient monuments in some ways of kind of asking questions about our present moment. And then someone else just kind of noting that they really appreciated the ways you talked about commemoration and narrative and making that very relatable to students, especially students who say maybe are from places like the Dominican Republic or Ghana or Senegal, who take such pride in their own monuments, and that something like that approach could maybe really capture their attention.
Yeah, no, I thank you for both the comments. I think that to the first one, right, the macabre, the gruesome elements of warfare are an indisputable sort of component of the narrative here. They're easy to kind of excise and skip over, but I think then you kind of end with a kind of an incomplete and maybe stilted reading. That the sort of coming to terms with what the Romans did and how they did it, I think is for us an important task in trying to understand them in their own context, remembering that their world and our world are different worlds governed by different values and different systems of morality. And I think that in terms of thinking about a kind of a comparative a discussion of commemoration, right? Generally speaking, civic monuments today, even ones that celebrate military success, don't tend to include severed heads. So I think that, thinking about something like monumental public art program like the Column of Trajan as a way to kind of, it serves as an artifact of kind of encoded collective values, and it lets us kind of interface with the Roman ones and appreciate and discuss and problematize how our world and their world are not the same, right? We haven't, some people like this idea that, oh, we're like the Romans, right? We've taken off the toga and put on the necktie. No, not the same, right? And so I think that we owe it to students to kind of, be reconstructive, but also be contextual in terms of trying to put worlds back together and talk about connections, but also talk about discontinuities between the two. In terms of the second comment, I couldn't agree more, right? I think that one of the things I try to do, and this usually gets squished in the end because the semester has gone over long and there's not enough space at the end, but I try to think about comparative things. So, not just, Lauren's excellent mention of the Historia column, but if you expand this to think about commemorative arches, there's, untold number of examples in terms of talking about how the arch monument has ended up as a commemorative thing in all kinds of places on practically every continent, right? And it's an interesting conversation about how these forms can be retasked, right? They can have a common sort of legacy, but they can be retasked to contemporary needs, contemporary cultural wishes, but they carry with them some kind of authority that's rooted in the past time and is dragged into whatever present that it's created. So I think that that's a very useful device for talking to students.
Yeah, and one that, I think students are really, really hungry for in our classrooms. And so, well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. This has been wonderful and so helpful. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with all of us today and share some of your approaches to teaching this.
My pleasure. And everyone is encouraged to get in touch if they want to know more or need more resources about things Trajanic. I'm happy to do it.
Jeffrey is very generous with time. And if people have follow-up questions, they can also post them to our Facebook group. And I have no doubt that Jeffrey would be delighted to answer them. So thank you again. And thanks to everyone for joining us. This was wonderful. And we'll be back up and running for the next round of webinars in the new year. So for now, we'll say goodbye. So have a good one, everyone.